Before we start this special edition of the podcast, I just wanted to extend my thanks to Lloyd's Register for sponsoring this year's edition of the Lloyd's List Outlook Forum. Thank you, Ella. Each year, Lloyd's List likes to gather a group of industry leaders, lock them in a room, and not let them leave until they have divined the fate and fortunes of the shipping industry for the year to come. And that's what we did earlier this month in London at the annual Lloyd's List Outlook Forum. Having gathered a baseline of crowdsourced knowledge from the ever-insightful Lloyd's List readers, we invited an all-star lineup of shipping's sharpest minds to join us for a discussion around the opportunities and threats that will be shaping shipping next year and beyond. We do that because, well, frankly, it's entertaining, but I think there is real value in these conversations because, as anybody who's been listening to this podcast will know, the industry is changing. Radically in parts, less so in others, but the business of shipping is having to adapt. Understanding the tipping points that will determine the future of the industry is, to my mind, important. So, that's the context of the conversation that you're about to hear. It's an edited series of highlights from the forum that included none other than Carrie Troth, Senior Vice President and Head of Shipping and Maritime at Shell, Tanij Luthra, the Chief Operating Officer at Zodiac Maritime, Andrea Olivi, the Global Head of Shipping at Trafigura, Michael Parker from Citi and the Poseidon Principles, and Nick Brown, Chief Executive of Lloyd's Register. I hope that you enjoy what I think is a very insightful conversation. And if you want more detail on the Outlook poll results being referenced throughout this discussion, head to lloydslist.com, where you can see the full poll, the results, and our annual Outlook report. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Trinity House. Wonderful, wonderful venue. Delighted you could all make it. So the first question on our panel, where do you see the greatest risk to shipping businesses over the next 2 years? What is keeping you awake at night? What is the biggest risk that you can see ahead of us? Carrie, you're sitting in the middle. Sorry, you knew I was going to come to you first.
I did know that, and the funny thing is I was hoping to go last on this one. So, because everything that's up there and probably everything that you're voting, we all see as risks.
That was Carrie Troth from Shell you just heard there.
But I'm the contrarian that says the thing that I see as the biggest risk is that we will indeed set its biggest opportunity as well. We will indeed set a regulatory framework next year with the IMO. Transport ministers, countries, member states will sign on to those. What I see as the biggest risk is that we don't engage the energy ministers in their national policy to ensure that the energy ministers make national policy set such that indeed fuels are made available for us. So today you see incentives around low carbon fuels going into aviation, low carbon fuels going into road, because of course these are largely within those energy ministers' portfolios. How do we get on their radar?
Andrea, let's come back to you. Biggest risks, what's keeping you awake?
A major incident on the shadow fleet, which can then really cause a major natural disaster.
That was Andrea Olivi, the Global Head of Shipping at Trafigura.
I think we keep forgetting that the shadow fleet continues to grow. We haven't really done enough to stop this. And at the same time, we hear anecdotal evidence that it's becoming more and more difficult for these vessels to trade, but these vessels are still floating, often with the crew on board, and we really have to think about that. And at the same time, as these vessels eventually will need to be scrapped, I'm worried about the emergence of a shadow scrapyard industry as well. And we are playing with the safety of people on board of these vessels. So that's one of the major things that we are.
The decisions we are having to make today, looking forward to decarbonizing our fleet.
That was Tanij Luthra, Chief Operating Officer at Zodiac Maritime.
To make them in a manner which is doable, which is sustainable in the sense of fuel availability and the uncertainties in terms of the regulatory landscape. It's a complex challenge, and we spent a lot of our waking hours, hopefully not the ones at night, but let's say concerned about that. And the second thing, you could say that keeps me awake personally at night is constantly keeping the safety and security of our seafarers out at sea very much in sharp focus in a world that is increasingly volatile in many ways.
I have no trouble going to sleep, but it's when you wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning, and usually shipping is the last thing I'm thinking about.
That should be a familiar voice to regular podcast listeners. It was Michael Parker from Citi and the Poseidon Principles.
I want to just develop a little bit on what Carrie said. If you look at some of these risks, they've been here all the time. Trump may be an extreme version of protectionism. The dark fleet may be a much bigger thing than we had with just the Iranians. All of those issues have always been there to some degree. The one that is different, and I think frankly fundamental, is the one around the failure to pass a global carbon tax. But let's just call it the regulations. The rest of the world outside the shipping community is going to wake up in April or October and discover that an organization very few of them had heard of has just mandated a global tax on emissions. And even Trump can't do anything about it. And it's going to affect every company in the world that moves things by sea. It's going to affect the technology, it's going to affect the investment in the energy sector, in the shipping sector. And to me, this is the most fundamental thing in the 40-odd years I've been involved in shipping, where every year everything was the same, rates up and down and this and that. This is the one thing that is different. And this is the thing, not only is going to transform the shipping industry, but it's going to transform global supply chains and have a huge knock-on effect into the technology. We may get to talk about nuclear at some point. Now I've mentioned the word, we don't have to. But the point is, this is going to change the industry. So if it doesn't happen, if the expectations that the Secretary General has created and the unanimous vote last July, if nothing happens, then it's a disaster. Because what will replace that? We'll have a global body where the emissions are small but will only increase, where countries came together and then failed to deliver on the policies to make it happen. And so to me, this is the most fundamental thing that has never been around, because everyone basically thought the IMO didn't do a particularly good job with previous regulation. And so all of these other things matter. We may not live the next 5 minutes if someone drops a bomb on us. But the reality for this industry, this issue is going to change this industry in a way we've never seen before in our lifetimes. And so if it doesn't happen, then we're going to muddle along, and who knows what will happen. And it'll make it very difficult for ship owners, for the energy sector, to know what to invest in. And because of the importance of shipping to every other industry, it has this opportunity to show leadership in actually advertising the fact it's already been reducing emissions, but then actually has a plan which the Paris COP asked the industry to do, which was to set out a way to decarbonize shipping. And that's why this is so important.
I'm going to flip back to a more thematic trend of decarbonisation, but specifically, what is the best investment opportunity for the shipping industry next year? And I ask that specifically next year because we've had an interesting year. For those of you who were out in Greece at Posidonia at the beginning of the summer, I was hearing the word pragmatism quite a lot, which was a sort of coded way of saying we don't believe in decarbonisation and we're going to order what is available now. Towards the end of the year, things were back up to speed in the sense that people were talking more openly about the fact that we are going to see a fuel standard agreed in April at the IMO Marine Environment Protection Committee in April. We are going to see a levy. So I feel like we are in this period right now of uncertainty, and the industry is sort of in two camps. And I put this question here because, whether you're investing in digital optimization systems, which seems to be the most practical suggestion from our Lloyd's List readership, or we're talking about dual fuel, and I've deliberately left it fuel agnostic, or efficiency retrofits or second-hand tonnage. This is really a question of, are you focusing on making the current fleet more efficient, or are you waiting for something to happen in terms of the fuel availability to come for the ships that are on order next? And I don't know which way the balance is going, but Nick, you've probably got the most accurate view of all of us here, because you're seeing all of Lloyd's Register's customers coming to ask you the same question, and I don't know. What do you think?
It's all of the above. I think there are very different camps across our customer base at the moment. Concern around asset price at the moment. So a lot of people very much focused on second-hand markets and how they can invest in their existing fleets. Others very determined, and it's clear, you can see which owners fit into this camp, that asset prices are not going to come down. There's still a huge peak if you look at the existing fleet of vessels that were delivered during the last, if you like, super cycle of 2008, 9, 10, 11, all of those ships heading rapidly towards 20 years of age. And a lot of the tonnage that has been, a lot of the ship types that have been keeping shipyards busy for the last few years and the coming 3 years are not necessarily the ships that are heading rapidly towards 20 years of age. So there's a lot of tankers and bulk carriers. Andrea's already said we've got some pretty spiky elements of the order book today that will still need to be replaced. I think there is still this hesitancy around global market-based measure and what IMO introduces next year, and at what pace that will be introduced and how effective it will be. But we're already seeing, actually, probably with Fuel EU, a lot of owners are not holding back. They're going for it. They're investing in dual fuel vessels across varieties of molecules, and pooling is probably the most effective thing that's driving that decision. That you don't need to be you don't need to be going alone. You can go here together with partnerships, different owners together, owners and charterers partnering, and I think that is lowering the risk for many people who are trying to make that first step into dual fuel.
Michael.
I want to answer this question as a banker, if you like, and the question to me is, what can a ship owner not afford not to do? And the answer is nothing. They can't afford, they have to do everything, and whatever, you understand what I mean. I did wake up at 3:15 this morning. The issue is, and this is the shift that happened during COVID, is the decision-making is moved much more to cargo, particularly in the container sector, and I believe that will follow in the bulk sectors. So it's a question of, can you fill your ship? Will there be a 2 or 3 tier market? Now that, of course, will ultimately influence asset values, but it's actually about, are you operating the most efficient ship, and therefore the cargo owner wants to fill your ship ahead of anyone else's ship. And I think that's where digital optimization systems and efficiency retrofits are a sine qua non. If you're not doing that, then frankly you are missing something and you risk going out of business in the long run. And the other reason for this is, whilst we will always seek to support our clients in what they do, and whilst obviously remaining a financially stable institution and, of course, not taking unacceptable risks, but the fact is climate risk is now very high on financial regulators' things to do. It ranks up there with financial stability, and they ask banks to assess each of their clients on their transition plans. And so all of these things are in how we look at whom we should provide capital to. And that's very important. So whilst the financial regulators are not yet providing incentives to banks to actually finance genuinely green things, and hopefully we will get to that in a couple of years, what they are doing is making sure that what we are doing is actually lending to the people who, in their view, are doing the right thing. And so anything that is effectively speculating on a fuel or not having dual fuel, that's fine, and that will reflect itself in the asset value. But if you're not doing the other things, especially when the regulations come out, you are going to be at a commercial disadvantage and therefore less attractive to investors and lenders.
I'm going to end on the big decision, the big thing that I mentioned at the beginning. Will we, as an industry, have the regulatory clarity next year, the IMO, that will unlock all of these great decisions that we're going to be making? Will the shipping industry meet its 2030 targets? Now, I'm distinguishing between the ambition that's already been set by the IMO, and let me remind you that we did, as an industry, via the IMO, agree the 2050 targets with waypoints in 2030 and 2040. The ambition is there. The detail that gets agreed in April and then clarified in October is about how we get there. It's about, is it a carbon levy, is it a tax, is it a fuel standard, etc., etc. The detail of what happens, that's the interesting bit. But will we get to the 2030 targets? We're at the end of 2024. So, a lot of the practical decision-making has already been made, and it would appear that most of you are still fairly negative about whether or not we're going to get anywhere near 2030. 84% of you in the room, which you're slightly, 59% of our poll said no, so there was a little bit more optimism. When it comes to 2040, a little bit more optimistic again, which I'd say has actually increased in optimism since last year, which is interesting. And then when we come to 2050, again, it's going up slightly. But we've still got around 40% of our readers who think we're not going to get anywhere near the 2050 targets, which is a little bit depressing, frankly. I'm going to end on this question, and we might have room for a few questions, but maybe a quick word from each of you in terms of whether you think we are going to achieve what we know we need to achieve at the IMO. Karen, let's start with you.
So I think 2030 is feasible. What we see in the pipeline, 2030 is feasible. 2040 requires us to have clarity in the prompt on the definition of zero, near zero, and the mechanisms to encourage us, whether it's a carrot or a stick, to make the investments. But I'll say on 2050, if we make 2040, we'll make 2050.
Okay.
So some optimism, hopefully, to close that out.
Andrea?
I think 2030, when you look at intensity targets, I think we will get there. When you read some of the sustainability report from a lot of ship owners and trading houses even, you can see that some companies are already there. When it comes to absolute targets, that's very hard. And I think without regulation, and this applies also for 2040 and 2050 targets, we're not going to get there. In order to reach the absolute targets, then we need regulations, and we need it as soon as possible.
Tanish?
Quite similar, I would say. We are quite confident that 2030 will be possible, and not without efforts, but it will be possible. I think beyond that, there's the unknown unknowns. So there's optimism, there's ambition, there's collaboration, but do we have the facts today to tell us how we will get there? No, we don't. So not to be the wet blanket, but a lot more needs to be done before we can actually achieve the 2050 ambition level.
Nick?
I think the industry is ready, the shipyards are ready, the technology is ready. We've got the ability to meet these targets, but I think we've reported, certainly as our organisation, 90% of the decision making and the investment is on the shore side, and we'll have the industry ready to go. Will we have the molecules in sufficient quantities in sufficient time? Depends entirely on regulation, and not just regulation from IMO, financial regulation, etc. So I think so much of this depends on what happens across the geopolitical landscape as well, and the effectiveness of global regulation.
In a way, does it really matter if we meet 2030 or not? Probably not. What's more important is what the IMO decides next year, because I think what will happen across almost every topic we've talked about, which will be uncomfortable for shipping, is that if the IMO does what it's going to do, then the rest of the world, and that means governments and everyone else, is suddenly going to be very interested in shipping. And that means that the insular, inward conversations that we've been having for 50 years will no longer happen, because you'll be then dealing with forces outside that will actually hopefully look very positively on it. And so we know that nuclear and renewables are essential if the world's going to get to 1.5. We know that the weather and climate are two different things, but we can see it everywhere in the world. The Mediterranean is now as hot as the Gulf and stuff. So, there are going to be democratic consequences for governments that don't actually deal with the climate change issue. And because shipping is an industry that actually is dealing with it and is relevant to everyone else, everyone will take an interest. And I think the first interest will be actually in what happens to the money. And so after, hopefully, the IMO passes the regulation by next October, to come in January 27, there'll then be a long discussion about who handles the money, who does it go to, what does it get invested and everything else. And at that point, the whole issue is outside of this industry. And that's why I actually think it will be accelerated. It may not be 2030, but actually the target will be met in 2050 because forces outside the industry will say, we need to do this. And that will have a knock-on effect. So I remain an optimist, even if you're just an occasional optimist.
And that's where we're going to leave it this week. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed having the conversation live. My thanks to Carrie, Tanuj, Michael, Andrea, and Nick for joining me this year. Thank you again to Lloyd's Register for sponsoring. And as ever, thank you for listening. We will be back with more soon. But for now, thank you and goodbye.